So the next presentation will be by Max Burnette, Senior Research Software Engineer at NCSA. He's going to talk about ingestion pipelines and workflows.
Hello. This is a presentation about Clowder as a foundational piece in data ingestion pipelines and processing workflows. I'll give a little bit of background, again, for those of you who might have missed the previous presentations, about the use of Clowder's API to do automated scripting for a wide variety of tasks. We'll talk a little bit about how extractors can be used to trigger and verify processing pipelines, and we'll give a few project examples. So once again, Clowder has a RESTful API that lets you do a lot of things you can do through the GUI, but programmatically. For example, you can create an empty data set whenever you need one, and it'll return the ID of that data set so you can use it for additional things. You can post new files to those data sets, so that's essentially how you upload files. And you can post metadata to the data sets and files you've uploaded. So if you combine these tools together, there's a very powerful scripting capability to basically create all the Clowder resources you need from your script. Just to go into a little bit more detail about uploading metadata, there are a few requirements. In the JSON content that you send to this endpoint, you need to provide an agent who's going to be shown as the author for the metadata that is uploaded. This basically means that it will appear in the Clowder GUI that a user or an extractor created that metadata. So depending on how you want that to be displayed, you can control this through the agent field. There's a context for the metadata. This is a JSON LD, JSON linked data concept. It allows you to define meaning for the fields that you're providing in your metadata. And then there's the JSON content itself, which can be an arbitrary JSON object, and of course, you can nest objects inside there as well. An important thing to understand later is that Clowder doesn't generally support put operations which modify things. Instead, you have to either create duplicates or delete and replace the things that you want to modify. So to delete metadata, there's a two-step process where you can fetch the list of metadata that's associated with a resource, and then you pick the ID of the metadata that you want to delete and send that along. And that doesn't have to be a manual process. If you know the name of the extractor or the specific information you're trying to delete, you can just look for that in the list programmatically. So when we think about this API, we think about the extractors that are going to be using it to perform the operations. So we'll start with a little recap of the things that you can do with extractors. Generally speaking, extractors can trigger from a variety of conditions. For example, a file of a particular MIME type is uploaded to Clowder, new files or metadata are uploaded to a particular data set, or other events that happen in Clowder that users may want to listen for and program extractors to listen for. When these extractors run, they connect to a RabbitMQ message bus to listen for messages sent from Clowder. And those include details about the event, such as what happened, what resources it's associated with, and so on. What's done with that message is then up to the extractor. An extractor can do whatever it wants. It can download data, it can derive additional data, it can look at the files themselves and do some kind of metadata extraction. And this is what we can leverage in order to do some interesting things in a workflow context. One thing that's commonly required in a workflow environment is the ability to very specifically control when particular steps are triggered. And so with that in mind, you can develop an extractor that requires fully manual triggering. In order to do this, you just assign no event listener conditions to the extractor. This means that it doesn't automatically trigger under any conditions. It just sits there waiting for a manual message. This manual message can come from the API, or potentially it could come from users submitting this through the GUI. This can be useful in situations where you have time-sensitive jobs or race conditions, and you need to wait for certain preconditions before you trigger that extractor. Examples of this include waiting until all files are uploaded to a dataset before we do some operation on all of them. We can trigger them at certain time periods, like a cron job, when data is uploaded from some remote server, or we can trigger based on another workflow management system. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The takeaway here is that while you've seen a lot of examples of extractors being triggered under automatic conditions, there are a lot of situations where you might want to have more control. A very simple example of Clowder being used for a workflow process is with our rule checker framework. So this is a special extractor that you can provide a set of rules to, and it executes those rules against data coming in order to verify a certain set of conditions before it triggers the extractor. So the key here is that it actually executes rule checks against a local Postgres database that it maintains for itself. This simply requires the user to write a small Python function that checks the existing contents of the database and this new input, which could be a new file or a new piece of metadata or something like that. And it executes some check. So you've written a rule. This rule could be Do I have all 24 hourly files uploaded? Do I have full imagery coverage of our target polygon if I stitch all of our geotiffs together? Have all the previous datasets for today's date been processed? Dataset extractors can do this to a degree, but the key is that Rule Checker can do this across datasets or even across collections. Any information that comes into the Rule Checker can cross-reference other information from other executions of the Rule Checker. So again, this is kind of a basic workflow framework that we've used in certain projects to coordinate the execution of multiple different extractors. And it can also trigger on complex criteria. So while the individual rules are simple, you can check as many rules as you want against each incoming data set, which makes it easy to write these workflows that can branch off in different directions depending on the conditions that are met. Here's an example configuration for Rule Checker that's available on GitHub. There are two key files that you generally need to edit. One is rules.py, where you implement the rules that you want to execute, and the other is the rule extractor map.json file, where you map these rules to the extractors they should trigger. And again, this is a fairly simple function that you write, which gets a standard set of inputs from the Rule Checker application. You can check the resource and other information to determine the output for your rule, and then update your configuration file to determine what extractors should be run as a result of that rule. Once you've provided these two files, you're ready to get started. Something to think about in general with Rule Checker or with other frameworks is this idea of rerunning extractors. So going back to the idea of deletion, Clowder will not automatically replace metadata even if it's from the same version of the same extractor. By default, if you post it twice, you will get duplicates. So to avoid this, you have two options. Users can manually delete the metadata before retriggering, which is not generally recommended, or extractors can actually check to see whether there is metadata from the same extractor already. They can replace older metadata, but if it's the same or newer, then they can simply end. The same thing applies to output files themselves in a dataset. So if your extractor generates files that it uploads to Clowder, what happens if that extractor is running and the file already exists? Should it regenerate it? Should it delete it? These are things that you want to think about so that you don't end up with duplicate data. Aside from the concept of Rule Checker, Clowder projects have had success chaining extractors together. This is a straightforward process where an extractor finishes and it submits an extraction message to the next extractor down the line. The TerraRef project, for example, had several discrete workflows triggering on raw data streaming from different sensors. Extractors were sometimes dependent on the outputs of multiple others, but not always. And the final job was a massive stitching of 9,000 datasets from a bunch of stereo image pair photographs. This is a typical diagram of what a TerraRef processing pipeline might look like, where each dark green box is actually an extractor. So there was a process by which the green box above would trigger the extractors below, and then certain extractors would wait for multiple upstream extractors to finish, and the ultimate logic that controlled this was only a few lines of code in each extractor, but it let us build these complex trees and execute them asynchronously. Another note about TerraRef and workflows is the way that we handled provenance with our extractors. So if you look at a particular data set, you can see not only what extractors were run on the right-hand side, but you can see any output files they created and any source files that were used to create them. This is something we'd recommend considering for your own metadata from your extractors. There are several projects that use Clowder in combination with NCSA's GeoStreams framework to manage geospatial data. The examples here are Great Lakes Monitoring, Great Lakes to Gulf, and the IML-CZO Critical Zone Observatory projects, which each involve the collection of data from sensors and different observation locations around the United States into an ongoing monitoring system. In each case, raw data is collected at the source and it's uploaded into Clowder, where users can access the files and metadata, and extractors can also extract that data into GeoDashboards, so you can see the data in a map and click on different sites. The successor to IML-CZO, called SciNet, is in the process of integrating Clowder into an airflow management system, where Clowder is just one component of a larger overall workflow that includes external pieces as well. So in this example, things like uploading files with the Clowder API, or checking whether metadata exists, or even manually triggering files can be individual steps in an airflow workflow, for example. This NIH project collected data from lab and Excel files into various types of extractors that process the data into data points where users can then view them on a scientific dashboard. So Clowder is used for the preparation of data for visualization. And overall, that's quite a few different examples. I'd love to talk more about ideas that you might have for Clowder and how you want to use it in your workflow. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Any questions for Max?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, this is Anna Lucic. I have a question about how easy it is to kind of like query the extractors, or how easy it is. I know that they can be stitched and that maybe one extractor can trigger another one, but how easy it is to, or is it possible to query them or to kind of like connect the data sources between?
Oh, well, I'll give you a couple answers and see if I've understood your question correctly. First of all, from within Clowder, when you see that metadata that's listed when the extractors attach something to a file or a data set, that can be queried. So if you have multiple extractors that are operating on the same data set and you need to know whether another extractor is finished or what information it exported, you could query Clowder to get that information from the metadata. But if you need the information before then, like if you've, for example, got a few different extractors that are running asynchronously, but they need to do something in parallel and you need to potentially communicate between the three of them, that would largely be up to the design that you integrate into the extractor. So, again, an extractor is really just a small virtual machine, a Docker file in many cases that's running somewhere. And sometimes you can run multiple copies of the same one. Sometimes we just run one kind of big copy. But if they needed to connect to the same underlying database or they needed to communicate with each other, you would need to support that in the design of the extractor. I don't know if we've ever done this, but there's no reason to say that you couldn't run an extractor that also offered a little Flask API that someone else could query. It's really a computing environment that you're able to customize. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but if there's more specific use cases you're thinking about, we could talk through those.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is helpful. What I was thinking about is that, like sometimes you have metadata about the experiment, and then you would want to connect it with the actual data, and then you would want to connect it with the process data. And I am imagining using an extractor to pre-process certain file or stream of data, and then connecting it with the metadata. And so I'm just kind of like trying to imagine how would that work. And because like the output of the extractor, like you would save somewhere, and then you could connect it with another data source, and then you could query that. So this is the scenario that I had in mind.
And so for the TerraRef project within Clowder, we used metadata to serve that purpose. The very first extractor that would run on our raw data would attach metadata that was just the sensor, like the conditions, the time, the camera settings, and all that. That's the metadata of the data set. And that's like the raw data. We would attach that in Clowder, and then all the other extractors that would run on that data or its children, its derived outputs, could query Clowder to get that metadata and use that. They would have access to that raw, all the stuff that was extracted from that initial extractor, the pre-processing, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that would be accessible. And with that provenance, if you remember that screenshot that I showed where it said, I came from this file, that provides the information necessary that you could make the API call to Clowder to get all that information. So for TerraRef, all those boxes that you saw in that diagram, we're actually querying the same piece of metadata that was from our preprocessor right at the top of that diagram. We just have one copy of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
And I see
great questions. Go ahead.
I see a question from Deep in the chat. So for a chain or canvas workflow, the task is picked up from the last success. That was how we designed it for TerraRef. Generally, we would have each stage, retry if necessary, if it failed or if it was terminated. And then once it was complete, it would send a message to the downstream workflow. Just to open up the hood briefly, the reason we did it that way early on, this was 5 or so years ago that we originally architected this. Originally, we wanted to avoid generating more messages in the message bus system in RabbitMQ than we needed. So rather than use Clowder's automated system of like, hey, a new image file has been uploaded. Do any of you need to pay attention to this? We skipped over that and said, we know exactly what we need to trigger. We're just going to send one message to that extractor. But that was only because TerraRef was such a large scale a project. So again, when we're thinking about this workflow type of environment, we wanted to make sure that it was performant. I think now enough things have changed in Clowder that we might design it differently. Some optimizations have been put in place, and the idea of each extractor chaining the next one down. If you're just doing a single line of extractors, it's A, B, C, D with no branching. You may not need something like that depending on your data volume. You might just be able to use Clowder's built-in automated triggering. But if you had, more of a complex processing tree or workflow like the ones we showed, then I think that it could make sense to have the extractors explicitly call the next jobs when they complete.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very impressive.
All right. Thank you, Max, for the great presentation and for all the questions.